Hello and welcome to Empower Your Wellbeing Session 4. I'm delighted you're here on this part of the journey because today we're going to be learning all about protein. Protein is one of those macronutrients that there is so much hype about in modern times, and I have this, I don't know how real it is, but if you go into a health food store or something and you see all the snack bars, the bigger the word protein is, the more expensive the snack bar is. So we have this whole thing about protein and where you're getting your protein from and protein and muscles. So we're going to be really finding out, what does the body need? What's the most useful thing to give to the body? And how can we avoid some of the potential harm and damage that can actually come from eating too much protein and different types of protein as well. So we're looking at the bonus and we're looking at the baggage to empower our informed choice. Now is a wonderful time to check in from your last session. So we've looked at carbohydrates, we've looked at fats, and I'm curious now for you, what is it that's been different? What have you added in? What have you swapped? Are you noticing that you're feeling any different, sleeping any different? What is it like adding in more nuts and seeds? It's a really great time to start gathering in and really acknowledging, following on that thread from last week, what is it we can celebrate? What is it we can acknowledge? Finding space now with your pen and your paper, maybe bullet pointing, maybe just free writing. What is it you're noticing? What is it that's important? What is it you're really glad to? And if you want to bring in some more food for the coming weeks, you can say, next time I'd like to. If there was an instance where, the snack thing got the better of you or you were caught out, next time I'd like to. And it can help us to really support what it is we do want to be doing, rather than that constant focus on, I shouldn't do this and this wasn't good enough and this was bad and blah, 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 blah. So we're heading into this informed, empowered place. So take this opportunity now, grab your pen, grab your paper, and let's get writing. When you began this course with session 1, we started off with this language of food talk, this ability to be aware, sensitive, and noticing the kind of relationship with food, our body, and ourselves that is going on that might be impacting our choices or the way we feel about ourselves. In the second session, we started to find out more about, what would empowered language look like? What would it be like if I was choosing? What would it feel like if I was the one saying, I'm trying, today I want this, today I don't want that. Nice, but not really worth it. I'm going to have this instead. Finding this space of really connecting with how it is we do want to eat, how it is we do want to treat our body. Then in our third session, we're stepping into this idea of being able to tune our focus to what is working to help us on that path, to feel really good as we're doing this. It's not about beating ourselves up. It's about celebrating and acknowledging where we are nourishing our body, where we are taking good care, where we are finding new ways to add things in, swap things, and maybe even discover some new recipes or snacks or ways of eating as well. In this session, I would love to look at the concept of treating ourselves. Now, if someone says to me, I'm going to treat myself, it generally means something along the lines of, I'm going to buy and eat something or have some sort of food experience that is maybe actually not so nourishing for our health. It's really clever if you look on, I think it's bars of like Cadbury's or Nestle and things like that, like the chocolate bars, the shiny packets. At the bottom, they'll say on them, treat wisely or treat wise. That's their website where you can find out about how harmful their products are essentially. Now, treat wisely is a command. If I say to you, treat wisely, that's an actual instruction. And what they're looking at here is, how can they create this idea that their product is a treat, that it's something that will add to your well-being, that will support you to feel really good. And what we're finding out through this course is the reality that they give us sugar spikes and sugar crashes. They harm the way that our body is functioning through the saturated fats. And most importantly, they lack nutrients. It's not just that, they're not so good for you. It's like they actively don't do any good for the body. And what the body is really desperate for is to receive the resources, the nutrients that are the most important for it to really feel good and to function for your mental and physical health. So this idea of treating, we might want to tweak. Well, what does a treat mean? Because it's definitely not wrong that we want to treat ourselves. It's definitely not wrong that we want to feel good. It's definitely not wrong that if we get to the end of a long day, we want something that gives us a bit of a, that feels better, or I feel nice now. The question can just become, okay, so how do I treat myself well? How do I treat myself beyond the agenda of someone else's profit margin? What would it mean to really treat yourself well? Now, it's someone I work with who is really inspiring. She was spending time with her children one weekend and they had a really difficult weekend. There was an argument, things were emotional. And that evening, her youngest son came to her and said, Mum, shall we get takeout tonight? And she knew at that moment that what he was saying was, could they do something when they all sit together? Because often when they had takeout, they watch a movie, and there's this whole culture, around that experience. And she realised what he wanted was some connection and some togetherness with the family. Previously, before doing this course and finding out about this, she might have been like, yeah, great idea, let's have a takeaway. Instead, she was like, okay, what do we really want here? What is the actual treat here? And instead, they spent probably less money than the takeaway. And they went and bought a game. And then they had the meal that they had planned that evening. And then they all sat around the table to play a game. And what that brought to the family instead was something much deeper, much more generative, and much more nourishing than if they just sat and had the takeaway and then had the salt and the sugars and the sludgy feeling afterwards, the sleep that's impacted by it, which then impacts the next morning. So this ripple effect into this downward spiral. Whereas just by swapping the activity, it's not necessarily about eating something differently, but being like, okay, what is it I'm trying to get from this treat? So treating ourselves well can then start to become this like whole world of like, oh, well, what will make me feel really good? What is it that I'd like to do right now? The best thing I would say about treating ourselves well is that if we're using food as a treat and it's one of our only ways of treating ourselves and we're eating foods that are not nourishing to do that, then really we have to limit it. It's like, oh, well, treat day on Friday, where people have this like little window where they're allowed to do it, which is a very, lack or restrictive method. What I'm not saying here is that it's not possible to enjoy food as a pleasure item, as a form of a treat. It is possible to do that. It's just that, do we want our only way to treat ourselves to be something that harms the body? When we step into this idea of treating ourselves well, what actually happens is we don't just have to do it on Friday. In fact, the more of it we do, the more enjoyable and nourishing our whole life is. Because when we treat ourselves well, we're deeply taking care. We're deeply meeting our own needs. Treating ourselves well can be as simple as going outside for a breath of fresh air, taking a walk, doing some crafts, reading, resting, talking on the phone with a friend. Anything that makes you feel good can be a treat that you can bring into your life to empower your well-being, so that when you go to bed at night, you look back on your day and you're like, yeah, I looked after myself today. I did nice things for myself. Maybe, we can tap into what we really care about. Is it connection? Is it about pursuing a goal? When I turned 30, I started playing violin, and I believed it was too late for that. You have to start when you're young. But if I live to be, I'm aiming for 114, but if I play violin till I'm 80, I'll have played for 50 years. So we can start to notice there's all these kind of stories maybe about things that we'd love to do and haven't done, but could do. And when we bring more of those things into our life, then we're really heading into holistic empowered wellness, because it's not just about what we do and don't eat. It's about really how we treat ourselves. So this is your invitation, extending out to you, to spend some time between now and the next session, asking what would it be like to treat myself well, and finding small ways, medium ways, and big ways of really, really enjoying that. It could be great now to spend a minute with your journal, your pen, your paper. How could you treat yourself well? Not things you have to do, not a to-do list. What could feel good? If you're not sure what that could be, it could be great to say to yourself, well, what did I love doing when I was a kid? What did the child me love doing? Because often there we find the things that actually really matter to us. So take the time with your pen and paper now, gather that in, imagine yourself doing it and what it might feel like in the next week or weeks ahead, and we'll begin our learning about protein. Proteins are created from bundles of information called amino acids. So these are little bundles of information that are quite literally the building blocks of life. There are 20 amino acids, and the body uses these to create thousands and thousands and thousands of different structures within inside the body. The body is kind of in a constant state of sort of sustainable recycling of amino acids, using them and then not needing them anymore, breaking them back down and passing them to somewhere else in the body where they're needed. So the amino acids are constantly in flux and in circuit within the body in use. So some of the things that amino acids make are things like collagen, muscle, antibodies that we use in our immune system, hormones, different enzymes for like digestion and other catalysts and change in the body. So amino acids are really important for the whole function of the body, including the health of the brain and building different tissue. And the body uses these 20 different amino acids and pairs them up in different forms, creating all the different things, thousands and thousands of different protein structures. Now, within the world of protein, because it's the building blocks of life, when we eat anything, we're eating some protein. Even if we're eating a carrot, it may not be especially high in protein, but it still contains protein. The reason I like to stress this is because if we think about things like fats and carbohydrates that we've looked at in the past few sessions, when a person has too much of the saturated fat, that causes active harm to their body. And when they have too little of the unsaturated fats that we really need, this is where we see risk again, where the brain can't create itself. So too much and too little in the fats causes serious health problems. Carbohydrates, we see a similar thing. When we have too much, especially things like sugar and syrup and flour, we see excess weight stored on the body, which causes risk to the organs and the body's function. And we also see a lot of inflammation. And this can lead to things like pain, issues with our mental well-being, the dopamine highs, the dopamine crashes, all these kind of things. With carbohydrates, if we have too little whole grain of the thing we really need to nourish the body, then we lack specific micronutrients that the body needs to function. So when it comes to fats and carbohydrates, there are very, very specific risk outcomes from having too much and very specific risk outcomes from having too little. Now, within the world of protein, there actually isn't anything to delineate too little protein as a condition. You may be aware of a condition called kwashiorkor, which is when someone is so malnourished that they are lacking in all nutrients. They used to call this protein deficiency, but now it's considered to be total malnourishment, total nutrient deficiency. So there is no word for a condition of lack of protein, because as long as we're eating food, we are getting in the different amino acids that are present in all the different things as the building blocks of life. Now, what is important within protein is that we get what are called the 9 essential amino acids. As we said with the fats, something that's essential in the world of nutrients means that we need to eat it in order for the body to have access to it. So in the 9 essential amino acids, we really need to be eating those in our diet. Now, quite luckily, they come in plant food and animal food in a variety of different places. So it's difficult to not get them as long as we're eating a good variety of foods. I frequently get asked, well, how much protein do I need? How many grams do I need? If you were to take roughly 0.7 grams per kilogram of your ideal body weight, which you could work out from your healthy BMI, the body mass index scale. It's not perfect, but it's useful. If you look at your age and height on the BMI and an ideal body weight, if you 0.7 grams times the amount of kilograms of the ideal body weight, what that will give you is roughly your daily need for protein. Now, for me, this particular tool of finding out our daily need for protein is most useful to check we're not having too much. Because there's so much pressure and stress now for us all to get our protein in, and protein shakes and protein this and protein bars and blah, blah, blah. What often happens is that people are having humongous amounts of protein, also as a form of like a weight loss tool. So rather than eating carbohydrates or fats, they're having more proteins. And what we're seeing here is that by having too much, protein actually starts to harm the kidneys. This is because the protein, specifically protein that comes from animals, actually has an acidic effect inside the body. So our blood prefers to be slightly alkali, just very slightly alkali. And when we eat something, as we know, it digests down into the body. The body, breaks it down in the stomach, passes it to the intestinal tract, and the intestinal tract passes it into the blood. Anything that goes into the blood will affect what we call the pH scale, so how acidic or how alkali it is. And we want things that help it to be gently alkali. Now, whenever we're eating meat or we're eating dairy, so anything that comes from an animal, including poultry and fish as well, this has an acidic effect on the body. And if the blood stays acidic, this is actually a high risk for the body and can cause serious organ damage and death, pretty much. Acidic blood is really not how the body can function. So what the body does then is our kidneys are actually monitoring the acidity of our blood all the time and are doing certain things to try to balance out the acidity. If the kidneys are constantly dealing with a high acid load, this is where we see damage in the kidneys. It's where we see things like kidney stones, and it's actually been associated with muscle and bone loss because the kidneys have to draw useful micronutrients that are in the bones and in the muscles to be able to balance out the acidity of the animal protein that's coming into the body. So we can end up in a little bit of a conundrum there where people are trying to have protein to build their muscles, but eating this kind of acidic protein is actually causing there to be a loss of muscle and an atrophy of bone, which is really dangerous for our long-term health because of risk of fracture, especially as we get older into our 60s and 70s. Our muscle and our bone health is fundamental, and we build it throughout our life, and we can support it in really good ways by choosing protein sources that are not as acidic or eating less acidic food. So if you're having a lot of protein, do have a little look at this to find out, am I having too much? Could I be causing risk and damage to my kidneys? I genuinely believe that in the next 20 years there will be a lot of people in their 30s and 40s with kidney damage because the amount of intense protein that people have been consuming due to the fitness industry, where they have a massive profit from people taking all the protein powders and the protein supplements with good intention. The people just want to have the kind of body that they want. They think it will really support them, but what it's doing in the blood and what it's doing to the kidneys is really high risk. And what we'll start to look at next is some useful ways for building muscle that could be interesting to you or some people that you know. So what can we do in simple ways to support our body to have healthy and nourished muscles? So in order for the body to be creating muscle, the most important thing to talk about here is that we have to use the muscles. Our body will not be creating ample amounts of muscle unless we are actively using them. So this means that we have to move. I don't really love the word exercise. It reminds me of being in high school, doing PE classes and feeling wholly inadequate. And what I love to do now is to talk about moving. How much I move my body in a week is something that the more I do it, the more I feel good from it. And I found ways of moving that really feel good for me. You might like the exercise word. If it works for you, completely stick with it. If it doesn't work for you, think about, well, how much are you moving in the average week? And what kind of movement could you find that you really love? I practice Qigong, I do some Tai Chi, I dance. If you've never heard of 5 rhythms or conscious dance, go and find it. 2 hours, a DJ plays, adults are there. The only rule is no talking, no drinking, and you just dance and move your body. It's life-changing. Anyway, 5 rhythms, conscious dance, go find it. Find ways of moving that make you feel good, and that might be going to a gym, but I genuinely don't believe that for the body long term, doing bicep curls, working on one specific muscle, is a holistic perspective of looking after the body. In studies done on longevity, so the people that live the longest in the world and in healthy and nourished ways, what they find is that the common thread is that they move a lot as part of their lifestyle and as part of their culture. This includes places like Japan, where people sit on the floor to eat. So even in the 80s and 90s, people get up and down from the floor with ease because they've always been doing it. So they've always been doing it, they maintain the capability of doing that. And I know that in our culture, if you ask somebody over the age of even 50 to get down on the floor, it can be something that's physically challenging for the body. So this isn't about isolating one muscle and doing your bicep curls. This is more of a holistic, how do I get my whole body moving in ways that feel good for me? Highly recommend dance, highly recommend Qigong. I run online courses, so you'd be really welcome to join in with that if it's interesting to you. What matters most is finding something that you actively enjoy, that actively makes you feel good. When I work with people with chronic fatigue or people that have had a lot of depression, I get them as a first thing to do just in the morning when they wake up to stretch. They don't have to do yoga, they don't have to get the mats out, just stood next to their bed or in the bathroom, quite literally just making themselves bigger, having an actual stretch, taking up some space in the body, moving around a little bit. When we do this, it starts to generate activation in the joints for them to loosen and warm up, and it changes the entire way that the body is able to function across the day. So if you're ever feeling very heavy, bring in a bit of stretching and it can really make a difference. Small things like this build into us being able to find movement that we love without it being prescribed as exercise or hurting yourself or working so hard that you're in immense muscle ache. There can be like a satisfaction with that, but that's not what it has to be about. It's about getting the body moving so the muscles can be engaged, so the body knows, I keep creating that muscle. Now, from a nutrition perspective to support muscle, it's fascinating. When you take athletes and you give them, after doing some movement, some exercise, some training, they gave some athletes the protein shake, and they gave some athletes a smoothie which had in it herbs, spices and fruits and berries. And what they saw was that after the movement, the people that had the protein shake compared to people with the smoothies, the people with the smoothies had a faster recovery time and improved performance in the days following having the smoothie. This is because, and we'll look at this in more detail in the next session, that the berries and the things in the smoothie contain the necessary resources that help the body to actually heal and repair the damage. Because when we use our muscles, it actually causes something called oxidative stress. So for oxidative stress, we need antioxidants. We'll cover all this in the next session. Now, with the protein shake, yes, it contained protein, but it didn't contain the things that the body needed to cure that damage, to heal and repair that damage. It contained stuff that can help the muscle to build, but fundamentally, that's not what we need at that moment. Protein is useful, but not as useful for muscle recovery, muscle healing, muscle repair, muscle support as eating things like berries, herbs, and spices. Now, there's one spice in particular I want to recommend, and that is fenugreek. Fenugreek is a seed that is incredibly hard, so I really recommend, if you're going to try it, getting it in powdered form. I try to have about 1/4 teaspoon each day, and that's not because I'm an athlete or I'm training or anything. It's because I know that fenugreek will support my muscles to build themselves effectively, which means that my spine and my posture will have more support because the muscles in my body have the things they need to be able to build themselves well. Helps me have my posture, which supports the entire function of the body, and then long into the future, things like my hips and my knees and the bits of us that can start to go from the wear and tear will be able to be supported by my muscular structure that's strong and functioning well. This has again been trialled in athletes as well, and it does improve performance and quickens recovery time as well. You can tell that this has been researched because if you go onto the internet, you can find fenugreek supplements and little capsules. If it's easier for you and you want to have a supplement or a capsule, great, go for it. What's inside of it is 1/4 teaspoon of powdered fenugreek, which you can buy in supermarkets with like a world food section, or more like Asian or Oriental supermarkets, in great big bags for less than a couple of quid. So fenugreek can be a great one to add in. Enjoying berries and any other herbs and spices can be a great one to add in. And in a way that maybe seems quite ironic, eating less protein can support your body to have healthier muscles. And this is because when we look at muscle composition, so the way that the muscle is built in the body and the strength of it, we see the most effective and useful composition in people that eat the most fruit and veg. And we see the higher level of atrophy, of the muscle wasting away, the muscle actually being eaten down by the body to be used elsewhere, in people that are on a keto or a high protein diet. And this is all to do with the acidic effect that the protein causes inside the blood and the release of high amounts of ammonia in the kidneys because the protein converts to ammonia. So this causes problems in the body. So the more protein we're having, we could actually be causing our muscles to waste. And instead of eating protein, if we swapped for having more fruit and veg, then we can actually improve our muscle composition and our strength long term. So it's all about the fruit and veg, it's all about the herbs and spices, and it's all about the berries, and finding ways of moving that feel really good for you. So it's becoming clearer what we can do to support the muscle mass of our body, and therefore the ability for our body to move and function really well now and long into the future, whether that's for your athletic journey or just for your body to have the good posture alignment and ease of moving, long into our later years. So we've got the basis of this. It's time now to look at protein and this idea of bonus or baggage. What is it that's coming along with the protein, and what does it do inside the body? So as we said, we need our 20 different amino acids, of which 9 of them are essential. The other ones the body is actually able to synthesize and create itself. So it's like having Lego blocks. It can break them down and build these other 11, but these 9 we have to eat. So the 20 amino acids, including the 9 essential, will be coming to us through our diet when we eat things with protein in. And we have to play this game of bonus or baggage. If we know when we eat something with protein that we will be getting these amino acids, the question becomes, what is it we're getting along with it? So we can either have protein that comes from an animal source, or we can have protein that comes from a plant source. If I'm thinking about examples of this, or an animal, we think of like meat, dairy, fish, and eggs. And if we look at it in the plant world, we think of things like nuts, seeds, beans. And I'm just going to put here all plants. Every plant has protein in it because protein is the building blocks of life. So it's in the carrot, it's in our greens, are another great example of this. I would say that in our big sources of protein, we've got nuts, we've got seeds, we've got beans, and we've got things that are made from these as well. So beans, you often see things like tofu and tempeh. These are often used as meat alternatives, so there's a lot of Asian recipes that have these in. If you do want to look at other meat alternatives, for example, veggie sausages, those kind of things, these can be another plant source of protein. Meat alternatives have been through some form of processing, and some of them contain nutrients and some of them have been intensely processed and are much more of an ultra processed food. A way of finding that out is doing the fibre test. If the meat alternative, the sausage or whatever it is, passes the fibre test, that gives some indication that it's still going to have some of the whole food nutrition inside of it. So when we're eating more nuts, seeds and beans, we're increasing our plant sources of protein. So you might have been having more protein in the last few weeks just by having a few more nuts and seeds. So now we have the question, okay, so am I either getting my protein from here or from here? And am I getting bonus or am I getting baggage? So if we look on the animal side of things, from our very first session, we found out that we need to be consuming carbohydrate. Carbohydrate helps the body to function, it's its main energy source, and we never ever get carbohydrate in animal products. It's just not part of the way that their bodies are formed. Whereas if we look over here at our plants, they can be a really great useful source of carbohydrate, which includes the presence of fiber, because fiber is the body of plants. So over here, we don't get any carbohydrate and we can never have fiber. It's not what their bodies are made of. But plant bodies are made from carbohydrates and are made from fiber. So we can get the higher sources of fiber here, which is a great bonus. If we consider back to our last session, we're learning about fats. There are some plants that contain the saturated fats, the coconut, the palm oil and the cocoa. But most plants are high in the unsaturated fats. The ones that are the most useful for our brain health. The ones that we want in great abundance, and we're getting these a lot in our nuts and seeds. So we're getting a lot of bonus here in the plants. We're getting the carbs to allow the body to have the best of its energy, we're getting the fibre for the health and support for the digestive tract, and we're getting the unsaturated fats to allow our brain and our body to function to the best of its capability. Now on this side, most products from animals actually are high in the saturated fats. And you might have been looking at some food labels and really noticing that, especially around dairy. So the biggest place of bonus here is in our plant food kingdom. And one of the things I'll be recommending this week is, can we add more beans to our diet? Can we find easy ways of doing that? Beans are some of the most nutritious things on the planet because of their micronutrients, their carbohydrates and their fibres. And the wonderful thing about beans is that there's many studies showing that people who eat beans live the longest. So they're a holistic nutrition ticket to feeling good today, tomorrow and long into the future. Now on this side, in our animal product side, what we're finding is that we're not getting the useful things and we are getting high amounts of fats that can cause damage in the body. Now there's another thing structurally different between animals and plants, and that is something called cholesterol. You've probably heard of cholesterol, and probably have heard of good and bad cholesterol, but what really is it and what does it mean? Cholesterol is always found inside animal products, every single one, and it is never found inside plant products. It is impossible for a plant to have cholesterol in its cellular structure, and it's one of the fundamental differences between animals and plants is that plants don't contain cholesterol, they have fibre. Animals don't contain fibre, animals contain cholesterol. Cholesterol is a fundamentally important part of your body. cholesterol simply means a type of fat. So cholesterol is a type of fat that, because it's a fat, allows it to have a waxy texture. And this is incredibly important for our cells. The cells of humans and animals actually have an outer wall called the cell membrane, this cell wall. And it's not a wall like the wall of a house. Because a cell is an intelligent, active and responding component of the body, the cell is allowed to let things in that are useful to the cell and release things from the cell that are either being given to the body or are no longer needed by the cell. So the cell membrane is actually this intelligent, porous structure that allows things in that are useful and allows things out that are useful. In order for this cell membrane to be able to let things out, it needs to have certain qualities which fats really support because of this waxy nature. So things can come into the cell and come out of the cell, and the cell can control it, like opening and closing doors. So every single cell of your body and every single cell of any animal body, in the cell membrane there is present cholesterol. So the body needs access to cholesterol, and it's so important that without cholesterol your body cannot create cells, which means that your body is entirely self-sufficient in being able to create the cholesterol it needs. Now, cholesterol is created in your liver, cholesterol is created in your brain, and it can be made in other areas of the body too, but these are some of the most important, prominent places where cholesterol is created. It's very likely that everything you've heard about cholesterol has been that cholesterol is bad. Cholesterol is really useful. Thank goodness our body knows how to do this. Thank goodness our body can create the fundamental building blocks for the cells of our entire body. The area of risk actually comes when we are eating the cells of animals. When we eat animal cells, that means that we are eating their cholesterol, and we're adding their cholesterol into our blood, because that's how it flows through our digestive system, the digestive process, and it goes into the blood. When that cholesterol comes into the blood, if we have too much and the body is overwhelmed and isn't able to manage or clear out the excess of cholesterol, this is when we start seeing problems within the body, which have been exacerbated hugely over the past 50 years because of the way that foods are being ultra processed and refined and stored. So what happens when cholesterol comes into the blood from our animal products? Now, cholesterol, because it is a type of fat, it can actually be damaged in the same way that oils can be damaged. Exposure to heat, light, and oxygen onto cells that contain the cholesterol in their membrane can then become damaged by the heat, light, and the oxygen, and this is how oxidized cholesterol is formed. Oxidized cholesterol is the place of risk, because if we were to look inside our blood vessel in the last session, we discovered that fatty streaks caused by plaque can build up in the lining of the artery. We found out that one of the ingredients of the plaque was saturated fat, and the other ingredient is in fact oxidized cholesterol. So it's the amount of oxidized cholesterol that comes into the body and ends up in the blood that determines how much of this plaque is building up inside the body and leading up first to risks of type 2 diabetes, and then building up into higher risk conditions as it progresses through time, because every time we eat oxidized cholesterol, it comes into the body and the body has to put it somewhere, and it slowly but surely builds up inside these vessels. Now, the body does try to distribute it evenly, so it can handle it for quite a lot of years, but eventually this build-up starts to cause some very serious issues. Now, just to speak for a minute about the changes of oxidized cholesterol in our culture, 80 years ago, when my granddad was a boy, if they wanted chicken, it kind of meant that they had to go in the garden and get a chicken or to go to the butcher. So we had chickens, and then they were, killed and prepped and cooked. It's during the killing, the prepping and the cooking that we start to see this increased risk of the damage from the heat, light and the oxygen. So here we will see some oxidized cholesterol. However, if you zoom forward in time to where we are now, it's not that it's killed, prepped and cooked in a short space of time. What we have now in our culture are things that have been exposed to huge amounts of heat, light and oxygen. So that includes things like deep frying, includes things like cured meat, it includes things that are part of the ultra processed product systems like egg or milk powder. Like, can you imagine if I gave you an egg and I gave you a pint of milk and I said, okay, make that into a powder? You know, how on earth does that happen? It happens through huge amounts of heat, light and exposure to oxygen, which means that these things have humongous amounts of oxidized cholesterol in. The potential cholesterol is the same, but the amount of oxidization can increase even up to 2,000-fold and therefore bring an incredible amount of increased risk into the lining of our blood vessels. Other things that impact the level of oxidized cholesterol include things like freezing and things being in the fridge because of the exposure to light and the oxygen. The meat industry knows all about this. The meat industry is very well informed that this is a major issue, and their solution to it, should there be enough knowledge in the public eye for this to start to cause a problem for their profit margins, is that their solution here is to say, hey, what we'll do is we'll put everything in red plastic, because red plastic blocks light from getting through. So things wrapped in, in cellophane and things in clear packaging are still impacted by light. So they're like, hey, we'll wrap everything in red plastic, we'll vacuum pack everything, because that will reduce the amount of oxygen. So can you imagine walking through the meat aisle or whatever it is and seeing all this stuff vacuum packed in red plastic to try to minimize the level of oxidized cholesterol? It's only because we don't know about it as a public and therefore can't make informed, empowered choices to do with this that this hasn't happened. What is it that makes this build up of the plaque in the arteries such a problem? And it's a bit like this. If we look inside the artery, this is where the blood is flowing, and the blood is traveling there to deliver nutrients and oxygen to wherever is needed in the body. This has to be a continuous stream of nutrients and oxygen for the body to be able to function. Now, through consumption of saturated fats and cholesterol over time, different meals, different snacks, dairy and meat and fish and eggs across, weeks, months, years of our life, this starts to build up. And at this point, a person might be diagnosed with something like high blood pressure, which is often an indicator of having a high amount of plaque inside the blood vessels. They might also be diagnosed with something like high cholesterol levels. High cholesterol levels is quite literally measuring the level of this buildup of plaque inside the arteries. Then a person might go on to be diagnosed with something like angina. Chronic angina affects more than 2 million people in the UK. And a person with chronic angina would struggle to walk from one side of the room to the other without having to sit down and gasp for breath and have incredible pains in their chest. And that's because their arteries are thinning. It describes them as narrowing. The waxy plaque makes it very difficult for the artery to expand and contract as it does do when we're doing movement or exercise. So this level of high blood pressure and high cholesterol, we get diagnosed with something called atherosclerosis, which means the narrowing of the arteries. As the arteries continue to narrow, it can lead to angina, where people get pain in their chest, or chronic angina, where people are physically then disabled by the amount of pain their body experiences. This is chronic angina. Now, as this starts to get worse, what we used to believe was that the plaque on a particular place within the artery starts to become so narrow that it could actually restrict and maybe even stop the blood flow. What we found out that isn't what happens. There might be an area where it's a bit more narrow, like here, but the risk is that some small amount of plaque here, like a little volcano, could erupt. It's like when you have a spot on your face. I don't know if anyone ever gets those. You have a spot and it looks small, but it's putting a lot of pressure and it hurts. It's this kind of thing. It's like it's putting a lot of pressure and it ruptures, and this plaque ends up inside the blood, and then it's going to travel around with the blood. And if that piece of plaque comes here, then it's going to cause a blockage. If there is a blockage, then that means the blood cannot pass, and it means that nutrients can't get where they need to get to. And if the nutrients and the oxygen can't get where they need to get to, then we end up oxygen starved in whatever area of the body is after this blockage. If this happens inside the brain, this is what we call a stroke. And then areas of the brain impacted by this oxygen deprivation actually die and experience cell death. And that's why there are the consequences that happen after stroke, where people lose certain functions of their body that their brain was controlling before. If this happens around the heart, then this is called a heart attack. These are some of the highest risk forms or outcomes from having cardiac disease or cardiovascular disease, CVD. And within the UK right now, more than 160,000 people every single year die from cardiovascular disease. And the World Health Organization state that more than 75% of this is completely avoidable and preventable. When we can understand that cardiovascular disease, it does have other factors, things like tobacco can have an impact as well, but diet is one of the main ones. And if it can be prevented, that is amazing. If it can be avoided, that is amazing. And the way we do that is by having a low cholesterol diet. If we don't put the cholesterol in, it's very difficult for the body to build these plaques in the blood. The wonderful thing is that even if a person has really high levels of cardiovascular disease risk, angina, chronic angina, all these things, given the conditions to heal and repair itself, the body is actually very, very capable of healing and repairing itself. This is an area of potential huge importance to well-being, because right now in the UK, just to put some of this into perspective, every 5 minutes somebody has a stroke in the UK, and every 7 minutes somebody has a heart attack. So this has a huge impact on our well-being for the person experiencing the condition, for people's families, and then the ripple effect this has on society from people's ability to engage in the lives they want, to the care required and the support needed. Now, if we're in the medical perspective, the forms of treatment for these conditions involve statins and stents. Statins are a prescription medication that is often given to somebody if they've got high blood pressure or high cholesterol. What statins actually do is interrupt a natural process within inside the body. This natural process that it interrupts is actually the creation of our own cholesterol. It does this by, in the journey of creating cholesterol, there's a few different things that happen on the way, and one of those things is the production of something called HM6 co-reductase A. So HM6 co-reductase A is used in the body by a few different processes, and when a person takes a statin, it means they can't produce this anymore. It inhibits the production of this. By inhibiting the production of this, then the body can't create its own cholesterol as effectively as it did before. So that means that a person has less cholesterol in their body and therefore will be able to use a little bit of this cholesterol. This is not the problem in the first place. The problem is not with our own cholesterol creation. The problem is within the cholesterol coming into the body through the consumption of animal cells. So if we look at how effective these are, the actual efficacy of these, for 6 years, which is a very long time to have this inhibited in the body, what we expect to see is a 3% reduction in mortality, which is not very significant at all. However, when it's 160,000 people a year that are dying, that 3% counts for something. But my question is that enough? If a person actually makes diet change, so instead of inhibiting the creation of our own cholesterol, we reduce the intake of cholesterol itself, so we just stop putting it in the body, and we do this by going to a mostly plant-based way of eating, then what they're doing is increasing their fiber, which is essential in this process for healing and repairing, as we'll see in a minute. And what they'll be doing is not putting the cholesterol in, so then the body can start to actually clear out what's been stored, because we're not just keep adding to the store cupboard. When a person changes their diet, when they have 4 years of being on a high fiber plant-based diet with low intake of cholesterol, not even no cholesterol, just mostly no cholesterol, after 4 years what we see is a 60% reduction in mortality. So this is huge. You take a medication for 6 years and see a 3% reduction in risk and no improvements in your other well-being, and actually potential harm from the side effects of the statins. However, If you change your diet, more plants, more fruit, more veg, more nuts, more seeds, more grains, more nourishing herbs and spices, then after 4 years, you see a 60% reduction in mortality from cardiovascular disease and huge improvements in people's mental and physical health and well-being, because what they're eating is super nourishing. So this is a generative change. This is something that impacts the entirety of the holistic form of well-being. So I'm not here to diss the pharmaceutical system. However, I am here to call into question about the efficacy of statins. And when they're worth more than $180 billion globally, imagine if that $180 billion could be invested in supporting people to have a more holistic and nourishing life. That would be a very, very different way of us living and interacting as people and as society. So the question can just become, when we're being prescribed statins, is that the honest best way to approach this? And the answer is no. But doctors, GPs, health services don't really have the funding, support or resources to really help people to change, to understand what's going on in the body and to make their lifestyle change in a feel-good, enjoyable and positive way. The other form of treatment that a person might be prescribed is a stent. A stent is where a little tube is inserted into where there is a blocked or a potential to block artery. Now, if an artery is blocked and a person is in cardiac arrest, they're actually experiencing, like a heart attack, then this is extremely useful, very effective. I think of it like a pipe cleaner. However, sometimes stents are put in as a preventative form, and they put the stent in to try to find out the area that will be blocked. However, as we know, this blockage could happen anywhere depending on the debris that actually comes into the body. So if there was a stent there, it could still block the stent. The Harvard Medical Institute did some research where they did something called pseudo-surgery. This is where they take 2 groups of people who all need a stent, and they do the entire surgical procedure with both groups, apart from with one group, they just don't put the stent in. They make the incision, they do the whole thing, but they don't put in the stent. And those 2 groups, they followed them over time. They both reported feeling better, which is very common when people have received medical care and attention. However, the actual outcomes of people having a heart attack was the exact same. The Harvard Medical Institute have said that using a stent is not curative, but it helps people with the internal symptoms, sort of the mindset of it. However, in the UK in 2019, there was still 100,000 stent procedures done for this preventative. However, this doesn't actually have the impact you want unless somebody is in cardiac arrest. So there is a huge amount of investment and money in these forms of treatment, which do not actually offer people a way out of the situation. They are mainly treating symptoms rather than the underlying cause. The underlying cause is the cholesterol coming into the diet, and the best way to do that is to step into this empowered relationship with food in our body and to reduce our cholesterol intake by simply swapping for more plant-based foods and a higher fibre diet. If you're worrying about potentially having a build-up of plaque inside your blood vessels, you'll be delighted to know that yes, with diet change, it does make a huge impact. Even for someone who's in their 60s, 70s, 80s or 90s, it seems that it's never too late to start reversing the damaging effects of having too much cholesterol and saturated fat in the diet. The way it works is a little bit like this, and it's a bit of a domino effect, but stick with it. When we eat food, it comes down into the stomach, as you know, and then passes to the intestinal tract. In the intestinal tract, between the stomach and the intestinal tract, is that bile that we spoke about that helps us to digest fats. Now, to create bile, the body uses cholesterol. And in order to create the bile, it works a bit like this. We have a gallbladder, and the gallbladder is the place that stores the bile, and we have our liver, and our liver creates the bile. So there's this interaction between the digestive system, the gallbladder and the liver, and when we need more bile, the gallbladder gives more bile, and when the gallbladder needs more bile, it says to the liver, hey liver, can you make more bile? And now liver is so clever, because what the liver does then, it asks this question of, is there any available cholesterol that I could use before I create more cholesterol. And this is where it gets really interesting in how diet change helps us to actually clear out the buildup of cholesterol. And it's a little bit like this. When we change our diet, when our diet becomes more plant-based, we're naturally increasing our fiber. Now, it's possible to eat a plant-based diet and eat highly processed vegan food. That is completely true. All the fake meats and all that kind of stuff, and you can live on bread and Oreos. Technically, they're plant-based, they're vegan. What I'm talking about here is eating more whole food, eating more fruit, more veg, more beans, more of the things we're studying in this course. So having a really nourishing relationship with food. When we do that, we eat more fiber. That's just what happens, because all those foods are high in the structures of the plant bodies, which is the fiber. Now, fiber comes in two forms, sticky and scratchy. The fascinating thing is that when we digest fiber, when it passes from the stomach through to the intestinal tract, the fibers naturally pick up some bile. The sticky ends up carrying some bile away, and the scratchy ends up carrying some bile away. This is natural. It actually helps to lubricate the entire system. Like, it's a really good thing. And through this natural process, what happens is that the body then is using more bile. So we increase the fiber, and therefore we naturally use more bile. And because we're naturally using more bile, that means that then we have to create more bile. And then the liver has to be asked, can you make more bile? And the liver at this point says, okay, well, what available cholesterol is there before I make the cholesterol needed for the bile? Now, you may have heard of good and bad cholesterol. There are two types of cholesterol. We've got high density lipids. Lipid just means a type of fat, because cholesterol is a type of fat. And low density lipids. It's to do with their molecular structure that makes a difference. Now, HDL is called the good cholesterol because it's got an ability to clean itself up and to clear up other bits of cholesterol that aren't needed. So HDL cholesterol is like a natural sweeping brush that allows us to keep the body clean, especially inside our arterial function, and allows the liver to be able to collect any available cholesterol to use for other things. The ultimate in sustainability and recycling within the body. Now, the LDL cholesterol is the one that builds up. So a wonderful thing at this point happens. We're naturally using more bile because we're eating more fiber. The body says, okay, well, I need to create more bile. So what it does at this point is that it sends the good HDL, the little sweeping brush, round the body and starts to collect the plaque. So meal by meal, snack by snack, high fiber choice by high fiber choice, the body is actually able to clean up the damage. This is why we see such a significant change, a 60% reduction in risk of death from cardiovascular disease in such a short space of time. And actually, even just eating like this for a few weeks, people start to feel better. When people with chronic angina, that severe pain in the chest, when they go on a 2-week high fiber diet, they don't have the same chronic condition even just 2 weeks later. So this is something that I really recommend finding out in your own body, making some swaps, making some tweaks, do it for a week, do it for 2 weeks, see how you actually feel, and then find out, okay, does this work for me? Does this work for my body? Do I feel different? Do I feel better? If you want to bring this into action in your own life, you could focus on what you're adding and adding in fiber, which we've kind of already been doing with our fruits and our nuts and our seeds. And this is where in this session, I'm really recommending adding in more beans. I generally use tinned beans because they're so easy to use. I take a tin of beans, I drain them, I rinse them, and then I add them to whatever it is I'm cooking to make it really, really simple and accessible. So you don't need to reinvent the wheel. You could work with a lot of meals you already have and just swap in beans, maybe from where you maybe had meat, or have the meat still but have the beans, because adding in the fiber is the thing that makes a really big difference. Lowering cholesterol is important, swapping out cholesterol, and adding in the fiber is still going to make a massive difference. So fruits, nuts and seeds, and really getting excited about having beans. This could be swapping from meat or dairy to more of the alternatives, because when we have the plant alternatives, we straight away remove the cholesterol. And this might involve a journey of discovery, finding out some new things, finding some things that you do like, and playing with it a little bit. When we speak about dairy, I'm talking about milk that comes from an animal and the things produced from this. So it includes milk itself, but also cheese or cream or any other form of dairy product, whether that's in milk chocolate or however it is. I include all animals in this, but most of the research is done into cow's milk because it's the most prominent one. However, other animal milks will still contain some of the things that we're going to speak about in this next bit. So people often say that if you're a vegetarian, then you've got to get your protein from dairy and you maybe have more cheese or something like that. Now within dairy, there's two specific protein sources. One, whey protein, and the other, casein protein. Now these two are available in abundance in health food shops in powder form, and that worries me for a lot of reasons, because one of the things that whey does is that it triggers growth. If you imagine a little baby cow, a little calf, the reason it's drinking the milk is because that milk is trying to make the calf as big as possible, as quickly as possible, because it's very vulnerable in the wild while it's young. So it triggers growth inside the body. Now, we have in our body something called insulin growth factor 1, which is a growth stimulant. And when we have this whey protein, it triggers growth and it triggers the release of insulin growth factor 1. In an adult body, if there is something going around, insulin growth factor 1 saying, hey, who wants to grow, who wants to grow, who wants to grow? If we have any damaged cells and then they want to grow, then this can stimulate growth in the body. When we speak about things like cancer, cancer often happens because there is a cell that is confused and has become separate in itself. So rather than the cells of the body all working together for an organ or a specific function in an integrated holistic system, what happens is the cell becomes damaged and then acts like an individual, and it behaves separately, and the cell then wants to grow and it says, well, I want to grow. And if you then provide growth hormone to a cell that wants to grow, then it is indeed going to grow. So we see an increased risk of many different types of cancer to do with this insulin growth factor 1. On the other side of this, we have our casein protein. Casein protein is also something that stimulates growth, which makes it a direct risk factor for increased levels of cancer. And in the last session, I said to you about maybe trying 3 days without dairy and this common response of, not the cheese, not the cheese. In the process of casein being digested in the body, it creates something called caseomorphine. Now, morphine is an opiate and it gives the body an opiate response. When we have an opiate response in the body, it can give us what I would call the numbing slump and give feelings of or senses of what I might call relaxation. But it is pseudo relaxation. It's not actually relaxing for the body. You're just having an opiate response. This is particularly high in things like cheese and cream and a lot of the substances that we maybe turn to for an emotional relationship with food. This is where we need to have a lot of self-compassion, because where we do have an emotional relationship with foods, they're usually high in dairy. You know, as we feel stressed or we feel emotional, we feel sad, we feel overwhelmed, whatever it is, this numbing slump can give us quite a little bit of relaxation. It's not wrong that we want relaxation. It's just that if that relaxation also puts in stimulating growth hormone, then that's a lot less useful for the body in its long-term health and well-being. What can be really useful to do is to notice where that emotional relationship with food is. Maybe if you're having cravings for things like cheese, things like dairy, things like ice cream, all that kind of stuff. Noticing that emotional relationship. If you want one-to-one support, that is available, but finding what it is you want instead can be incredibly useful. So in that moment, what is it you actually really need? And this is where treating yourself well can really come into its own, because rather than trying to just numb ourselves out with an opiate response, we might find a more generative and supportive way of actually meeting what we actually need. A question I commonly get at this point is like, but what about eggs? What about eggs? In one egg, there is approximately 180 milligrams of cholesterol. If you were to ask the UK government what they recommend around cholesterol, is that they recommend to have around a maximum of 200 milligrams a day. That means wherever you see that maximum, it means eat less than, or ideally less than. For men, it's 300 milligrams a day, and for women, it's 200 milligrams a day. But once a person has, a high risk of heart disease, then they say 200 milligrams for everybody. So I think this is just a pretty good place to stick as a general point. This 200 milligrams is just of the cholesterol. It's hard to measure the oxidized cholesterol because it depends how long something sits in light in its packet or how it is cooked. So this measurement is how much cholesterol will come into the body from having an egg, and depending on how it's cooked and used and that oxidization process, it could be 10, 100, 1,000 times this. What we're noticing here is like, are eggs bad? Eggs are not useful for the body in terms of their cholesterol consumption. And if anyone does have a cholesterol issue, I always highly recommend swapping something else for eggs. One of my favorite swaps when it comes to eggs is I used to love scrambled egg. And now I greatly enjoy instead having something called scrambled tofu. You might have had tofu before or not. There is a brand spelt tofu or clear spot. I really highly recommend these two brands. I don't love all tofu personally. This one, tofu, is sold in most supermarkets. It's not genetically modified, it's organic, it's actually quite inexpensive, and you can make a lot of alternatives with it in a really satisfying way. So scrambled tofu could be something to go and discover in the world. So if we were to bring all this session together, what we're finding is that when we're choosing a protein source, we can choose either between plants or animals. When we're choosing an animal product, it will have animal cells in it and therefore will add to the cholesterol load inside the body. If this happens frequently, day in, day out, just through simple things like milk in the tea at the morning, cheese sandwich at lunch, biscuit with a bit of milk chocolate on it, maybe a dessert with cream in it, slowly but surely all of this adds up and builds up as cholesterol inside the body, causing great risk and great harm. What we found is that swapping to more plant-based sources of protein, one, helps the body to clear out all that potential damage, but secondly, it actively nourishes. It's got all the bonus of the fibre and the carbohydrates and the potentially the unsaturated fats as well. So this week, I'd love to invite you to find out what it's like to go a bit more low cholesterol and a little bit more high fibre. And this is where swapping really comes into its own. Beans are a great thing to add in. The meat alternatives and tofu and tempeh are great things to try, because people often say to me, well, isn't a veggie sausage or a plant-based sausage an ultra-processed food? And it's like, well, yeah, it may be an ultra-processed food, so definitely do the fibre test. But if I'm comparing eating a pork sausage with a plant-based sausage, the plant-based sausage is potentially going to have vegetables in it, beans in it, high fibre, and the pork sausage is definitely going to have saturated fat and cholesterol. So if I'm choosing between those two things, I know which one it is I want to choose. And the purpose of this course is for not for you to become some perfect whole food, I only eat things I made myself from the organic shop and blah, blah, blah. We're finding ways of navigating our food culture in ways that feel empowering and useful to us. And by being able to have meat alternatives and swaps, it can allow us to engage easily and make diet change in a way that feels supportive and actually possible and sustainable. We're not trying to create a stressful relationship with food. We're trying to create an empowered relationship with food. So let yourself try something new, discover, see what actually feels good for you. So we're giving this a go with the diet. And we're bringing in this idea of what it can mean to treat ourselves really well. And when we're treating ourselves well, I would say this is a fundamental paradigm shift in our mindset of what it means to have self-care and what it means to actually be connected to yourself. Asking, what do I need right now? Can be a really, really profound sentence that can change our relationship with food, because it can support us if we're having emotional eating or stress eating or boredom eating or whatever it is. And it can actually allow us to meet our needs on a really, really deep level and support that entire holistic perspective of wellness. If you have any questions about this session, please do feel so welcome to message. And if you'd like some one-to-one support, that is available too. Thank you for joining. I wish you a tremendous amount of joy and curiosity in exploring this low cholesterol, high fiber life. And I look forward to next session where we'll be looking more deeply into the micronutrients and the gut microbiome.